I was reminded of a line that I had read a long time ago, which said, voting is essentially an act of hope.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories.
So here's my story. And I would say this in the context of the day that this episode drops, not the day that we're recording it, but the day that this episode drops is Election Day.
Oh, that's right.
I was thinking, in the midst of all of the articles on every news outlet on who's ahead and who's behind and what swing states and what swing counties are bringing out the vote and all this stuff, I was thinking about the people who didn't vote in 2016 and, more importantly, are not going to vote in 2020. And I was reminded of a line that I had read a long time ago, which said, voting is essentially an act of hope. And in listening to some of the people who said that they were not voting, what I heard was that they either didn't think their vote would matter.
Right.
Maybe they thought it wouldn't matter because they were, say, Republican in Maryland, and Maryland would always go Democratic.
Or even Democrat.
Or Democrat in Maryland.
Well, look, there's no way Maryland's going to be anything other than X. So
right. And so in a lot of the country, I think I've heard, 44 of the 50 states, it's kind of that way. You know where your state is going. I happen to live in Pennsylvania, which is a big swing state.
Sure.
But for most of the country, they live where, maybe their vote matters, maybe it doesn't. But I was taken by the voting is essentially an act of hope. And the two reasons that it said that is, one, maybe my vote won't change the outcome, it doesn't count. Or two, the people at the top will do what they want to do anyway, and they're corrupt or they don't follow through on their promise. And so nobody's voice matters. And I was thinking about this in the context of running a company, because as a business leader, we are often subject to decisions based on voices we hear. Sometimes the voices are of outrage or of encouragement. Sometimes they're suggesting this program. Sometimes they're critical of this direction. But it's the people that you don't hear from, the people who essentially don't vote. And the curious thing to me, and I've seen this in a number of companies, is, number one, whether I'm correct that the reason these people don't vote, don't lend their voices, really is because either they think it won't matter, or they think that that theirs doesn't matter because it's a foregone conclusion, or that nobody's matters because the company is only seeking input as window dressing.
Right.
So I was just wondering if you've encountered discussions with leaders about the best way to reach the people that don't necessarily vote, and to have more people lend their voices, and the task of convincing them that their voice does matter, if in fact it does.
Well, I'm glad you ended on that line, because I think that's one of the really interesting places to start with the way you posed the question. I mean, there are a number of things I wrote down while you were talking that I want to come back and touch on, but I think that's one of the most honest places to look to begin with is does their vote count? Like, why do you want to hear from them? Do you really want to hear from them, or do you just want to feel good that you heard from everybody? Because I think
that you asked the question.
Yeah, I asked the question. That's enough, isn't it? Because if you really do want to hear from people, then you need to be prepared to hear from people. And as we've talked about in other episodes, that's not always the easiest thing. I do think that, in the same way that quote says, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's disinterest. I was sitting in, as you were talking, I was reminded of a few months ago, I was sitting in on a leadership team meeting that I facilitate regularly, and they were getting the results back from an ongoing engagement. They hired an engagement company to work on company engagement and culture, and there are all these metrics and fancy dashboards and whatnot. And there was quite a lot of, they're looking at over time where people don't answer the questions, they don't. And so there was the uptick of like, oh, people are actually getting involved in the survey. That's good. Even if they get involved and say nasty things or not nasty, but if they're very critical, that's still better than. And it took a lot of reminding the leadership, because they're like, oh, well, they weighed in, but they're super unhappy. And she was like, please do not imagine that a silent voice is happy. It could be. They might be. They may well be that it doesn't matter and they don't really have much to say. But disengagement or a lack of, if somebody just feels like there's no point and there's no hope, then that is far worse than any amount of people being critical, because those people have hope. They're actually investing their energy into the company. It's critical energy and you have to be a grounded enough leader to deal with that. But I think getting people to speak up, I think first comes back to making sure you are really honestly wanting them to speak up and understand why. Making it easy, and then a whole litany of things about how you sustain that hope, because you can get them to speak up once, but if you shoot them down or tell them why they're wrong with that feedback right off the bat, you're not going to get a second one. So to me, it's the sustaining hope, which doesn't, and I think this is the tricky part, that doesn't always mean doing everything you hear that people say they want done. That it doesn't take that to sustain hope. Right?
No, I think it first and foremost takes something that gets these people to believe deep in their hearts that they were at least heard, that there was time and mental energy spent on listening to them, even if the answer is no at this particular time.
I'll tell you one of the, and I can really only speak for myself, because I think what makes you feel heard, what makes you feel considered is a really personal thing I have found, especially just recently. Like what people want in that situation is often quite, it's almost like the 5 love languages, but like very different things people want and need to feel heard. But I know for me, part of being heard is just like, even if the other person's curious, be like, oh, what did you mean by that? Like, then they continue to disagree with me top to bottom. They need not shift one ounce, but if they're just sort of, if I can tell that they're trying to understand or consider or see what I'm seeing, that scratches my itch. I'm like, oh, okay, you're at least sort of like seeing this piece and trying to understand what I see. And then I want to be able to understand what the other person sees. And that can also be really tricky sometimes. So I think getting that balance working, but I think, sorry, I just totally lost my train of thought, Elliot.
No, that's okay.
Like, choo-choo, left the station.
But I was thinking when you said just expressing curiosity on what did you mean by that? That's why when I'm asking about feedback for anything, whether it's in my firm, whether it's of a webinar or a presentation I did, why I try to stay away from the rate this on a scale of 1 to 5, because what did you mean by a 4 meant, well, you weren't godlike perfection, but if I put anything less than that, I'd feel bad. Instead, I'd rather them write in their own words an answer to a question, because that will enable me to ask a follow-up question. What did you mean by that? Or I didn't understand that. Or can you explain more? Because people aren't going to explain more about a 3. They're just done at that point.
Well, I also think, and I don't know where this heads, but it just occurred to me. So it's something kind of interesting to explore, at least for me it is the difference between just feedback in general, which we've done numerous episodes on, and this concept of voting, which I think does have a higher level of expectation of outcome. It's not just, hey, if you have any thoughts, toss them in the bag. There's a decision being made, and you have a vote. You weigh in on how this works.
There is a granting of power.
Yes.
To a certain extent. So it's not, you're right. It's not just say, what did you think about this thing? You're saying, I am granting you a measure of control of the outcome.
Right. And that's not a thing that, at least I don't think happens a lot in business for legitimate reasons, but also, I don't know, not illegitimate, but just not like, I think there are reasons you don't always want to put something to a vote, because consensus, majority consensus isn't always the right reason. But I do think to follow along with, because you're right, voting does have a certain amount of power. So if someone isn't interested in that power, it must be because they don't believe that there's any power in that vote, one way or the other. I just, by the way, was listening to, I think maybe it was a Radio Lab episode, I'm not sure, but they were exploring this. And apparently I had to get out of the car, so I didn't hear where it was in the United States. Somewhere in the United States, they do this at a very local level, but nationally they do it in Ireland, I think it was, where you vote for your first, second, third, fourth, however many you want to do. Or you can just vote for your first choice for president or prime minister, whatever it is. And it's so fascinating because what they do is they go through and they count like the first votes of everyone. And then they read off the rankings. And if you're last, or the last, I don't remember how they made this, but if it's just statistically impossible that you could win, those gets off. And then everyone who voted for those bottom three people or whatever it is, their second vote then counts. So your vote lives on. It's not just this binary, this person or that person. And it's a way that your vote continues to matter until, sometimes, and then the whole story that they were portraying was this woman who was pretty low, like she was almost near being cut in one of the first few rounds, but enough people just didn't hate her. She was like the fourth or fifth vote for a ton of people, and she ended up winning.
If I recall, that's how
that story?
I got date. But actually, in U.S. politics, in Maine, I believe that's how they do it.
Is it in Maine?
And there are a number of places. The Iowa caucuses. That's one of the places that came under such criticism in the primaries for the Iowa caucuses. Because you had if this person doesn't make it, all of these votes go to somebody else. It's very hard to calculate. I think Nebraska's second district, I think that's why the votes are split in Nebraska. The electoral votes are split in Nebraska because it's an odd way to do it. But actually in the first draft of the I don't know if it's the first draft, but the U.S. Constitution, it was the leading vote getter would become president, but the person in second place would become vice president. Which
I think is fascinating. I mean, that certainly does have this, a little bit, but it was the first time ever I heard somebody refer to democracy as a system where the whole point of it is that everyone's a little bit disappointed and that you're constantly changing it and constantly tweaking it, which I thought was kind of interesting. But to take it back to business for a second, I think, and I don't even know exactly what it is, but there is something about your vote continuing to matter that I thought was really, so it's not just vote for X, Y, or Z. It's but if there were a lot of people who had a second, third, or fourth choice of these other things, those matter too. Maybe it's just that sort of constant drive for there's being space for nuance, I guess. Maybe.
Well, right. No, there should be space for nuance. You should take certain things into account. It reminds me of, we have one of the programs that we use to run our company, our firm. We've worked with it for years, and they've been tweaking it like you do with any software program, and it's been fine. But the latest tweak that came out was they announced that, hey, for your security, we're going to force you to change your passwords periodically. And you could choose whether it's 30, 60, 90, or 120 days. And I had used the same password because it's just in our office forever. I had used the same password for 3 years, and it would automatically.
Elliot rocks! Exclamation point.
Yes, Elliot, of course. Elliot rocks with a 0 for the rocks. And, so, and now that we said that, I probably will have to start using that. Anyway.
Actually, Elliot's sitting there going, how did you know?
Completely replace Elliot is awesome with a 0 for the. But I wrote in because they said, let us know what you think. And so I wrote in, I said, I hate this. Mm-hmm. Why don't you have a never option? Why are you deciding what my security needs are?
If it's for my security, then I can decide if I want to lock the door or not.
Right. So why did you go out of your way to make this less convenient for me? And so they got back to me and they said, hey, thank you. I will add your comments to the list of people who asked for a never option. And I replied, I said, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that one is coming, or it's just on the bottom of on the top of a pile or something? What is it? They said, no, we don't know. We have no idea. We're keeping track.
Mm-hmm.
Like, fabulous. Okay. So that's where I was extremely frustrated. My vote did not matter, even though they asked.
Well, it does. I mean, it sounds to me, I mean, it's almost, and I've seen these done technologically. I mean, it sounds, which may be how they're doing it, but with those like feature requests you can make to thing, and then you can have like up to, you get 3 votes for other features that you want to like, up level in the list to try and get them to be the thing. And when something gets to the top, then that's how they prioritize what happens.
Yeah, but that raises the other question, which is, I'd like to know progress. So if I'm taking my time in order to respond to them, to put in a vote, I at least want to know, well, is this something that they said, you know what, we didn't get it. It's such a pain to do this for us. I don't know why it would be, but it's such a pain to do this for us. Or we've only gotten 4 people out of our thousands of users that that wrote in this, that we're not going to do it. Mm-hmm. And I don't like being left in limbo. I don't like being left in limbo where, yes, here's my opinion, and then it's just an empty void. It's there was a saying about dropping a rose petal in the Grand Canyon and waiting for the echo, and that's what I feel about so many of these things when I do take the time.
That's a very depressing quote. Dropping. So we talk about like this. That is the opposite of a hope quote.
Well, it's a neat way to bookend my story from.
I guess. Well, I want to actually talk about hope though for a second, because it was sort of the side. It was the side topic or the subtopic of a topic on voting, but I actually think that it's really core to the real question that you're asking of how do you get people with the assumption that what you want is for people to vote based on that assumption.
Right.
And how do you get people to vote and using this assumption that it's hope, it's the hope, like how do you create hope and how do you sustain hope? And why does hope matter? And it reminded me, and forgive me, I feel like we should do one of those like trigger warnings. This is a somewhat upsetting scientific study, but the only reason I've ever muttered it again is because I think it's a really powerful thing that they proved. It's really terrible. So it was a study with rats, and terrible story. It's a study with rats and in a cylinder tube where they have to swim, and the lights are off, and they had them swim until they can't swim anymore and they drowned. So anyway, and then they did it again. I know. It's I really struggled to even tell the story, but just bear with me, because they were trying to study hope. And they did it, and this is how they just, I'm sure they could have come up with something less disgusting. But the other way they did it was that they had the lights on so that the rat could see that there was
right
other stuff out there. I don't know, a dude who's watching him who won't come out. Maybe that's,
right.
Yeah.
There's callousness.
Yeah, I know this is terrible, but this is really profound, and really it makes me emotional to think about, not just for the rats, but also what it means about the power of hope is when the lights were off and they couldn't, so they were just blindly swimming. I think the maximum amount any rat swam was like 2 hours or something like that. It was a long time, but a reasonably compared to the other answer. And when the lights were on, when they could see things, it was like 20 hours or 24 hours or something. I mean, again, the story just becomes more tragic and upsetting. Yes. If you imagine this poor rat, I mean, it's awful. Terrible. It's terrible. But if you can assume, and I don't know, because I can think of a million reasons why this isn't the case. If you can assume that is demonstrated hope, that having the lights on creates some sort of hope, that's a pretty powerful distinction of what creating hope for someone or something actually does.
Well, that's true. On the other hand, it also says to me that with a little bit of transparency, you get a lot more out of working people to death. But that may not be the ultimate.
I don't think that was where we're going. But I do think there is something there where, and it's the only reason that I would even mutter this story. If you take that and you extrapolate it out to less barbaric and awful and disgusting, I mean, who designed that study, for God's sakes? Like, who wanted to study hope badly enough that they're like, let's do it?
And then did they go out to happy hour to meet their friends? Like, so what are you working on? And then they're talking about, well, I'm taking hope away from lab rats.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't done an extensive search, but I have looked for a better scientific study that I could use in its place. Because as you could tell, like, I can barely tell the story. But here is what I do take from it and why I will occasionally stumble through muttering that terrible story. I do think there are parallels that when somebody has no line of sight to what matters and what actually has value and what is out there for them, if they don't have a perspective on where a job could go or a project could go or a career could go or a relationship could go, when everything seems really closed in and there's not a lot of options, then it's really hard to breed hope in that kind of environment, I think. Whereas if people can see, they have more information, they feel more connected to things, I think that is part of how you begin to create a sense of hope that people can.
No, I think that's right. And I'd be curious to know, and I mean this seriously, in the rat experiment, if when the lights are on, what they saw. In other words, if they saw, in the distance, the possibility of reaching shore or reaching safety, because I think, at least the way I would take that study is that, people will go a great distance if they actually see a purpose, if they see a reason to expend that energy. But if you deprive them of the reason, if you keep them literally or figuratively in the dark, then they will give up much sooner because there's no reason. Yeah.
Wow. Can someone tell a joke or something before we wrap up? This is really wah, wah, wah.
Well, I can end on something that's totally unrelated to the story, but it is a rat story. And that is,
do they die?
No.
Oh, good. Okay. Do they wear little hats and dance?
No, they showed empathy. So there was an experiment where they took a rat and they put him in a very restrictive environment, not hurting it, but in a very restrictive, like a tube thing. And the rat could be let out with a spring. So they put another rat in the cage with him. So the one rat was free wandering around the cage. The other one was encased in this tube. And they found not only would the free rat spend a lot of time trying to get the other rat out, but they also found that when they gave food to the free rat would not eat all of it. He would spend his time trying to get the restricted rat out and save some for the restricted rat. So it showed empathy and caring.
So now you've expanded my emotional attachment to rats. And so now I feel even worse about the other study. So, who knows? Maybe this will be the absolute perfect episode for election day.
Yes, there's empathy and there's hopelessness, and it's all contained within one species. And this is important, one podcast.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories. You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything everything.
Including wrangling us.
Including wrangling us.
Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.